Hey, aloha mai kako. Welcome to the 18th installment of the KLML Center for Sustainable Island Food Systems Brown Bag Speaker Series. Want to mahalo everybody for joining us today as we turn our focus to a critical and often overlooked dimension of Hawaii's agri-food landscape, food system resilience, and disaster preparedness ahead of the annual Hawaii Food System Summit. My name is Ioane, and on behalf of the center, I extend our gratitude to today's speakers and attendees for being a part of this important conversation on food security, equity, and ecological resilience in Hawaii. Please scan the QR code on the current slide to access our center's website, and we'll also be dropping relevant links as well as a link to our website in the Zoom chat throughout today's session. A YouTube recording of today's webinar will be sent out to our MailChimp subscriber list after the event, along with the recap, highlights, and a preview of our upcoming webinar events. If you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter, please email me at komal@hawaii.edu to be signed up. A little bit about the center. The KLML Center for Sustainable Island Food Systems is an initiative of the University of Hawaii system, co-directed by Dr. Noah Lincoln and Dr. Albie Miles. And our mission is to uplift food system transformation across Hawaii by supporting food security and justice, ecological sustainability, education, storytelling, policy, cross-sector collaboration, and community partnerships. This series was created because across Hawaii, food system work is dynamic, creative, and impactful, but often siloed. So the Brown Bag Speaker Series exists to bridge those gaps, share stories from the field, and build alignment around the most pressing issues facing Hawaii's food future. Our long-term vision is to understand how the UH system can best support food system transformation in service to the people and Aina of Hawaii. In some of our broader work, the KLML Center engages in applied research and policy analysis, community-based education and convenings, cross-sector partnerships linking academia and practitioners, and by convening voices from agriculture, policy, and community, we seek to strengthen Hawaii's path toward food sovereignty and ecological balance. Today's topic and format: each of our speakers will share information from their unique organizational and community perspectives, and audience interaction is via the Zoom Q&A feature. So please submit your questions at any time, and we'll address them during the moderated discussion. So today's topic is a conversation on food system resilience and disaster preparedness in Hawaii ahead of the annual Food System Summit. The session will examine how Hawaii can better prepare for, withstand, and recover from climate-related and other systemic disruptions that affect food access, supply chains, and community well-being. We'll look at some of the intersections of emergency management, local food production, distribution, logistics, and community-led response, and how coordinated planning can reduce vulnerabilities before crises. We'll also explore how the 2025 Hawaii Food System Summit serves as a statewide platform to align research, policy, practice, and Aina-based leadership for a more just, regenerative, and disaster-ready Hawaii. And some of the contexts and structural challenges for and emerging opportunities here. Hawaii's food system is uniquely exposed to shocks from extreme weather and wildfire to port disruption and supply chain interruptions. So while remaining highly dependent upon outside imports. So without delay, introducing today's panel, we're honored to welcome our distinguished speakers, each bringing a vital perspective to this discussion. We have Dr. Albie Miles, Associate Professor of Sustainable Community Food Systems at the University of Hawaii, West Oʻahu. He's an educator and researcher focused on transforming Hawaii's agri-food system toward greater self-reliance, ecological integrity, and social equity, and is a co-organizer of the upcoming Hawaii Food System Summit. We also have David Lopez, State Disaster Recovery Coordinator at the Governor's Office of Recovery and Resilience. He leads statewide efforts to advance disaster recovery and long-term resilience planning across Hawaii, bridging emergency management, infrastructure, and community resilience to strengthen preparedness and response. And with that, we're thrilled to begin today's conversation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Albie Miles to start us off with opening reflections on where Hawaii stands today and how coordinated cross-sector action can build a more resilient and disaster-ready food system for our islands.
Fantastic, Ioane. Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. Very pleased to have this conversation today with David Lopez, who I had the good fortune to meet in 2019. David was a part of a series of critical conversations that brought together, city, county, state, federal emergency management agencies with some of the private sector food distributors, including Chad Buck at the Hawaii Food Service Alliance. And since then, there's been an ongoing kind of collaborative effort between myself and the University of Hawaii and some of the city, county, state agencies. So this is a bit of a kind of revisiting some of the analyses that David and his colleagues have done, looking at critical systems across the state of Hawaii. And the intention of this forum today is give David an opportunity to provide a high-level summary of some of his analyses around critical systems and points of vulnerability in Hawaii. And well, there'll be some opportunity for questions and answers, and then I'll guide us into understanding what the Hawaii Food Systems Summit is going to be focusing on this year, specifically food system resilience and disaster preparedness, and what people can expect from that event. And so without further ado, I want to turn it over to David to provide a high-level summary. Throughout the presentation, I may pause and ask David for some points of clarification. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A throughout the session. And so, David, if you are ready, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm going to try and share my screen here. And so do we have the presentation up?
It looks,
Are you seeing?
there you go. It started, David. Go for it.
Okay. So you seeing full slide then? Okay, great. All right. So yeah, I'm with the Office of Recovery and Resilience, and as was well stated, you heard our mission, and we'll just jump right in. One of the things that we've often said, I heard said was by Vern Miyagi, hope is not a plan, back when I started in emergency management. And we've been trying to build plans ever since, as Albie has stated. And so what I want to try and talk to you today about is kind of our overview of critical systems. Are the slides changing?
We're still on the Office of Recovery and Resilience introduction slide, David.
Okay, let me see.
There you go.
Okay, yeah. So want to talk you through, as Albie said, a high-level look at our vulnerabilities based in the critical systems. And we started a systems approach, and I'm going to talk to you real quick about that so we're on the same sheet of music. And then I'll get into Hawaii's situation, basically what we're facing. Then that may lead us into some resiliency building conversation. So let's jump into systems approach so that we understand. When I first started, we kind of looked at everything by the storm or the threat. We changed that because we weren't really tackling what was happening to our systems. And when I say systems, I mean the kind of the overarching systems that keep our state running as what we would think of normal. So you can see the medical system, food and water system, fuel products, electricity, transportation system. You notice that ports rises a little higher above that because, as you see when we go through, and some of you may know, the ports are just an integral part of keeping the state operating as we know it to be normal. We have to understand our demographics, so I want to point out a few key pieces here. And if you look in that bottom left-hand corner, you kind of see our vulnerable populations diagrammed out, and you see a big 19 in there, the amount of people that would more than likely seek shelter in emergency. But what this is telling us, when you add all these numbers up, that we're looking at a population of about, or a number of about 50% of our population that is more than likely to be seeking some type of assistance from the government or emergency management or other NGO organizations in an emergency. And that is quite high. That's a lot of people to take care of them. And then on top of that, if you look to the right side, you see our tourism population, which I call our silent population, because roughly every 10 to 15 days, we have an increase of about 15% of our population just through tourism. And so this is, again, another large group of people who aren't prepared to stay within the state for a long period of time, lack resources, especially if there's an emergency or exigent circumstances, which more than likely the state would have to take care of some portion of that body. So the emergency management system and the response system, to include all the volunteers and NGOs, we really have a large group of people that we have to take care of if something happens. And so, very important. We're talking about scarcity of resources and then having to take care of a lot of people. So the other piece of this is systems, and it's understanding that all our systems have interdependencies and cascading effects, and try to align us. We'll start in the bottom right-hand corner. We'll talk about power. Most of us think about power. We understand if the power goes out, we don't have lights, no refrigerator, can't watch Netflix and things like that, right? But when we transfer that up to the system level, so if you look at the middle blue column, that speaks to our ports and transportation system. If we pull power from the ports, then that means our gantry cranes aren't working. That means we're not being able to unload the big vessels that come in containers. And now we have a shortage from everything to food to every other type of commodity or a piece of equipment that comes in. And if you look in the center where the bars are up here, you'll see very quickly that if we can't offload and we start losing shipments, especially in the food and water aspect, then very quickly we start dropping well below market level or market capacity of what we would consider normal. So just missing 5 days of shipments, we're below 40% of our market capacity in food and water. And then when you transfer that down to another system, like say the sheltering system, they're going to be feeling that too, because we don't have big supplies built in sheltering. And then if you transfer that down to a workforce, which is the bottom left corner, showing all the other systems that make up bringing the state back online. If people aren't eating, if your workforce isn't eating, they're probably not going to work. And if they're not going to work, that means a slow recovery for us. And that it really increases the risk of death beyond the impact of just the storm. And we saw this in Puerto Rico, where 69 people died as a result of the impact of the storm because they couldn't do and understand these interdependencies. A year out, as they moved into more of from a response to recovery, their death toll had risen to 3,000 people. So that gives you an idea of the seriousness of understanding this. So let's talk real quick about Hawaii's situation to kind of understand where we're at. And when I'm speaking to this, I'm talking about everything from our logistics and how we operate to kind of what we have on hand. And so some important facts up front is that we import about everything that we use. There might be a little bit of exception with like fuel products, because now we're starting to produce a little more biofuel than before. But in general, most of our fuel comes from outside sources too. We've got a very long, complex supply chain. It takes up to 14 days to reach the market in normal conditions, and that's a pretty long time in a first world country. In all of our systems, we're based in an on-demand society, or an on-demand economy, excuse me. And what this means is that we don't really replenish surplus. We replenish warehouses in the sense of we're just trying to get things to market. So any type of movement is basically breaking bulk from what it was shipped in, repackaging it so it can go to market and get into the user's hands. Not very much built up in surplus. In general, throughout our systems, we have aging infrastructure, very little, and in some cases, no redundancy in capabilities, which of course makes us very susceptible in emergency conditions. Our airports, and more important, our air cargo, simply do not have the capability or the capacity to relieve all the systems at once when we have an emergency. Just can't do it. Port of Honolulu, as I mentioned above, with no redundancies and capabilities, is one of those single points of failure, meaning that its commercial capabilities can't be replicated in any other commercial port within the state. And when we look to open something, or the Port of Honolulu, in catastrophic conditions that were very seriously damaged conditions, there's an expectation that it'd take at least 30 days before we'd start getting some type of actual logistic operational support through there, and probably months before we get up to 100% capacity. In general, when we just look at port closures, it takes about, for every day that the port's closed, it takes about 5 days of normal operations before we see a change in inventory on the furthest ends of our market. And that's with no other stress on any of the other systems. That's simply because the port closed. So as we go through this, keep this in mind, because we're going to start laying some damage on top of these systems so we understand where we're at. You definitely have to understand the logistics of the state as we talk about not only our operational capacity, but what it takes to come back online after an event. I'm not going to go through all of these numbers, but the bottom line here is it takes a long time to get stuff here. And even in the best conditions, it's very difficult to get 1 million of anything here. And when we talk emergencies, that's what we mean. We need to get a lot of unit items here, a lot of big bulk items here. And as you look at this, you can see that our sea legs 6 to 8 days long. Of course, air is much faster, but just can't compete with the bulk rate of delivery of sea, nor the economic rate, which is, about 4 times the cost of sea freight to air. So just as I was saying before, the air component, although it will help, it will not relieve stress of the logistical stress of all of our systems at one time in an emergency. Looking at our logistics chain, I've talked about the top 3 bullets already: big importation, long complex supply chain, single points of failure. And then when we look at Oʻahu, Oʻahu contains on its south shore major logistic ports and other infrastructure that directly or indirectly affect the whole state, all located in the same proximity. So you can understand that being exposed to those same threats, if we lose that south shore, take a hit, then it's going to be very, very difficult to get things back to normal, and it will still have a great effect on the rest of our neighboring islands. In general, to give you an understanding in numbers, our air cargo, it does less than 10% of our total cargo importation. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we're at. That's just normal conditions. Normal conditions, just for food and water, we have to have about 3,000 tons of food on average coming through our port system, or in the Costco's or wherever you shop, as well as on the way home to your cupboard. Anything less than that, then is when you start seeing the shelves looking bare. Okay. A lot of people don't understand too, is that especially on any type of natural disaster where we can do a prediction on warnings like tsunamis and hurricanes, we shut down the port for protection. And so we actually stop our importation. And that's really when our clock is starting to count down on all of our markets and all of our stores. So, and in a hurricane, that can be as far as 3 days prior to it actually making landfall. So we're already under the clock, draining down our resources. And we also know that whenever we get these warnings, we have a rapid depletion on our market capacity, because everybody floods to the market, right? And then they buy down. And then, of course, after the event would mean that our market's basically empty. There's nothing to go to. When we look at our on-hand resources, and I say operational capacities because nobody keeps things at full capacity. They keep everything where it's operational, and that gets to that on-demand economy that I was talking about. It's simply too expensive to warehouse and keep storage of surplus and other things on hand that you're paying for but not using or turning them over rapidly within the economy. And so we turn over everything very quickly. It's on demand. And what that means for emergencies is that there is no emergency surplus. Okay, in general, with everything operating correctly, we have about 5 to 7 days of food and water that come into the state. On average, though, it's about 3 to 5 days. So unless we get caught under our last big shipment and containers coming off the vessels, our average is about 3 to 5 days of food and water and food products in the marketplace. Like I said, after about 5 days, we're down below 40% of food products, which means that's paper plates and M&Ms and ketchup and things like that. So not really sustenance. Our emergency shelter system, the simple truth here is the supply can't meet the demand. We have a limited number of hardened shelters, especially important during hurricane threats. And we're seeing our emergency management agencies in the counties to try figuring out alternate ways to do sheltering. Our medical system's about the best placed at about 3 days of general supplies, about 7 days of pharma in total throughout the state. Might be a little lower if you look at each county without transferring pharma across the counties. But where we are kind of hurting in our medical field is in our workforce. We have general workforce shortage, and our hospitals operate at very high capacity, somewhere around 90%. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. In our fuel systems, besides importation, we have several single points of failure in the system. We have basically one offshore mooring point that delivers crude from the tankers into our refineries. And now we're down to one refinery on Oʻahu too. So we used to have two, we lost one. And so again, single point of failure. If we lose that, then we're left to having to bring in refined fuel. Electricity, what we have here is each island is basically a standalone system. We don't have a mutually supporting power system. So that means when, say, Maui goes down, we can't flip a switch in Oʻahu and deliver power to Maui. Okay, approximately 60% of our power plants are in inundation zones, so highly susceptible to the flood and inundation threat. And like every other field that air system, and what I've alluded to is that there's very limited inventory on components and major end components to keep the system going. For our ports, because we're so reliant on ports, we did a heavy look at that. And again, the bottom line here is that we don't have any large scale salvage or dredging equipment. All of that would have to be ordered out. Best case scenario, we could get a salvager in right around 7 to 10 days if he could set sail right away. But chances are that wouldn't happen. It'd probably take longer to locate and get someone here than that. We were working, or the state was working on an alternate port concept, but that is somewhat stalled with material handling equipment problems and things like that, and in making an alternate port site ready to actually operate. And with our airports, roughly anywhere between 4 to 15 days of fuel. We have cyclic fuel delivery to our neighboring island airports. So there might be a wide variety based on when the last fuel delivery was in their flying schedule. But as you can see, that could go very quick if you have to move to some type of around the clock air traffic and so forth to deal with anything from passengers or even to bring in more logistical items and change to a more air cargo setting, but still not much fuel on hand. And again, emphasize the idea of air cargo in capacity is very low compared to what would be needed in an emergency delivery. So just as we move into to understand, well, also too, we're coming to the end of our hurricane season. Thank goodness we didn't see one of these, right? But this is just a reminder of the size of these storms. This is Katrina. And if you overlaid our state on the area where Katrina hit, you could see a storm the size of Katrina could easily produce some major impacts to our whole state. And I think that's the awareness I want to bring out here. This is Lane, very similar to size in Katrina. And you can see again, these storms are big, they're very powerful. And when we first started doing these presentations, a lot of people didn't believe a storm, a hurricane could really hurt the whole state. But as you can see with these shots, that one of these storms could easily engulf the whole state and the whole state feel its impacts. So after something like this hits us, what would we expect? This is what we call kind of the burn rate to critical. You know, where are we at once our systems start being weakened? We've already kind of talked through the first that we don't have long-term surplus of any materials. So right away, spare equipment, major end components are going to be hard to find to put the systems back together again. And this also includes workforce. The runs on emergency goods, as we stated, deplete supplies above our normal rates. So until we can start opening a logistics line, we will probably run out of things that we need. When we look at food and water, we're probably critical within 5 days. We do have some emergency rations that we'll talk about. But the other thing I want to bring out is the bottom of the sheet where it says ports. There's a good chance that we would lose our ports in a storm of Category 3 or above. Category 3 hurricane is actually the smallest hurricane that starts bringing about the most damage to our infrastructure. So that's really not very much storm when you look at 4 and 5, the size of 4 and 5 storms. Okay. Again, talking about our ports, we don't have an alternate port idea anymore. So again, we're kind of stuck with whatever we're left with the Port of Honolulu. And you can expect in a Category 3 hurricane, you would have inundation to the terminal at HNL. So that gives you an idea of the inundation prospect that we're after. So let's go dive a little deeper real quick into food and water. Critical at about 5 days. That means some people will probably have run out of food. There's no large surpluses. I mentioned that we have some million MREs. As you look at the right side, you can see some of those. They're in the FEMA warehouse. But you can see from those numbers that a million really doesn't go that far when we're talking about taking care of the whole population. And then on top where it says food supply, you can start getting an understanding of what I'm talking about, air cargo and bringing things in, because just to feed a million, I use C-130s because most people know what a C-130 is. It would take 30 C-130s every single day to feed Oahu. So that gives you an idea of although that's a powerful capability, it's not enough to keep us sustained and working and in a recovery mode. Shelters, I've already spoke to this. The counties are working on different sheltering methods. There is a shelter retrofit program, and it's trying to be improved so that we actually come out with some hardened shelters. But right now, simply not enough shelters for demand. Our medical system, I told you that they're probably our best supplied, which is true. I also mentioned about the workforce and the high operating capacity. What this means for us in the medical perspective is that mass casualties become the weakness. It's hard for the medical system to absorb mass casualties with a low workforce shortage and a high operating capacity. Then we look at fuel products. I've mentioned the single points of failure. And so you can imagine that if we have to start importing refined fuel, what the cost of our fuel is going to be until we can bring that oil refinery and the ability to offload crude up. So you can expect some fuel shortages there. The other aspect of fuel that we sometimes forget is that the fuel storage facilities are next to the water also. So highly threatened by inundation. And if we have ruptured tanks or contamination, then the fuel can't be used. And if we have ruptured tank too, then we have a problem because the fuel is spilling and leaking all over. And that leads us to problems with not only just straight recovery of decontaminated areas, but also that's going to hurt us economically because of tourism. People aren't going to come to oily beaches, right? And that's another huge consideration that we'll face in a big recovery piece. And electricity, we've mentioned the standalone systems. The other piece of this is that our transmission and distribution, or T&D, which is our overhead lines, are almost entirely put on wooden poles. So there has been a movement to change these to steel or other improved methods of poles, but still we have a high inventory of wooden poles within our system that makes us very susceptible to the wind threat. There has been an upgrade or an uptick in solar and wind, but that is directly attached to the grid. And so even with that, if the grid's down, we're probably not going to be able to use solar and wind in the same manner as before pre-storm or before the disaster. It just creates an instability and it's hard to bring the grid back up. And then we have some particular interests with power. Like if we look at County of Maui, the Ma'alea plant it's obsolete. So we're always in threat of an immediate loss of that power plant right now. Kahului is not far behind. And so that creates, unknown factors of how you do complete power restoration in, say, the County of Maui. So we have some unique factors in there that are really, really important to look at as we go forward. And of course, with your concern over food and water, electricity, power, and things like that is probably the next level in how you maintain those things and bring them in. So what's it take to come back online? The big thing to think about here are the two top bullet points is that we're going to have an increased workload with a reduced workforce. About everybody who we've talked about who we've talked with who really does some good planning around their workforce in an emergency condition say that they probably will have a reduced workforce for at least 6 months or so, of about 30%. There's also two restorative considerations that you have to look at when you're in this post post landfall or post emergency environment, meaning the major portion of the emergency is over as far as the threat goes, and we're trying to respond and recover. You have the daily operational demand. That's what we're trying to get done today. Are we trying to feed people? Are we trying to build bridges? What are we trying to do today? Because we're going to need equipment or resources to do that. But we also have to look and plan for what we're doing tomorrow, because we have to work to get to normal conditions. And so you have to have two sets of minds. You have to worry about how we're doing things today, but you have to have another mind and another group of people thinking out to the future and say, hey, how do we get to the better place and plan so that every day is not an emergency? And, it's a tough job to do. We saw that in the wildfires. It was very difficult to strategically plan out when you're under the pressure of response. Talked about the 1 to 5 day ratio, and you can see based on what I've been telling you that 1 to 5 days can quickly change if you start putting damage to the ratio with your systems. So for instance, if you start saying, well, there's no power, there's no transportation lines because of debris management and debris clearance issues, you could easily see where turning that 1 to 5 days could easily turn into 1 to 10 days or 1 to 15 days before you can get your transportation and your logistic lines open. You could expect after a catastrophic event that our food and water would be down. We'd be at what we call a hand-to-mouth resupply, and that roughly means that we're bringing in food as quickly as we can, delivering it as quickly as we can, and then it's being consumed equally as fast. Shelters are going to feel the same problem as the rest of the population. No resources. Medical, probably the best case, will start with a hand-to-mouth resupply, but be able to come online probably a little faster, especially if they can get fuel, because they have power at their source with generators. Fuel, again, until the port becomes open or you fix the ability to import at the offshore mooring point, we'll probably be bringing in refined fuel. And electricity, again, long-term look, we could be without power for months. In some places, straight no power. In other places, it would probably cycle on and off within the circuits and repair. Our port, you could see that probably coming back open within 20 days to 30 days. The hope would, of course, be have some type of throughput by the end of 30 days, but that is really optimistic, especially when you do other case studies of other ports. So that gives you an idea of kind of those 30 days post an event like this. And to kind of lock it home, our first line of support is the West Coast. As you can see, they're a long ways away. If you look at Puerto Rico on the right, you can see equidistance from our first line of support. Puerto Rico has basically half the North and South hemisphere within that same distance, right? And we know it took them a year to get into their recovery because of some of the issues we've just discussed. So you can imagine with our isolation that those conditions could easily become magnified. And with that, Albie, I'll turn it back over to you and see where we want to go.
Very good. Thank you, David. I think I'll start with a couple of follow-up questions that also includes some opportunities for you to speak about resilience building, particularly in the food sector. But first, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question around from where you sit in the governor's office. What do you see? And you've illuminated quite a few of them. What do you see as the kind of the critical vulnerabilities that affect food access, and what can households do to best prepare for some potential interruption in the food supply in the case of a natural disaster?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say, remember that first slide, hope is not a plan. So have a plan. In much the same ways that I kind of ran through these systems, you can kind of scale those down to meet your household. So understand in your house what it takes to feed and water for sustenance in your house, and then understand what type of food you might need to do that. What are your capabilities? 14 days is the recommendation for the state. So I would start with that and then try to match, 14 days, have that so that I, basically don't have to leave the house. And then you can start matching the other things like power, maybe get power generation or generator where you can have enough fuel to augment some electric and power needs for those 14 days and so forth. And then you can build everything exactly that same way where you kind of understand what these austere conditions mean exactly to you.
Very good. So a follow-up question, David, thank you for that. So at a minimum, a 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine at the household level, knowing that the FEMA supplies are inadequate and they don't include necessarily medicine, and that HYEMA and the county agencies are not in a position to distribute food because they simply don't store it. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think outside of the kind of proof of concept that Chad Buck did with the City and County of Honolulu DEM, I don't believe that there's any other formal, storage of emergency food within the state. Everything would, if there is things. It's at a lower level and it's very community organized.
Yeah, yeah. So just to follow up on that is, I think not that long ago, you and I had a conversation about, there's multiple ways and multiple levels of building kind of redundancy that enhances the resilience of a system when there is some kind of external shock. And so in addition to that 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine, that seems to be a foundation. On top of that, these emergency food distribution pods in vulnerable communities is another. Is that correct? And could you speak to what the state has planned, if anything, in order to replicate what was done as a pilot in Waianae?
Yes, so that's exactly right. So the idea would be to, if you're thinking big picture first, we've lost the port, so we've lost our ability to bring in food supplies. And so the idea is to have this surplus, enough surplus to bridge that gap it takes to bring the port up to some type of importation. So yes, that is exactly the idea, that you would have maybe on each island 2 or 3 strategically located emergency food storage areas where people could go, or they could push from those storage areas to distribute food to the population to help bridge that gap.
Mhm.
When I was at Hawaiʻi, we did put forth a plan to do that, to buy and warehouse this type of food. Our office wants to revisit that. Obviously, when I was at Hawaiʻi, we couldn't get it passed in the ledge. We couldn't get support. But our office is trying to reestablish that and look at revisiting that option. It's probably the cheapest option and can be done relatively fast, all within basically the power of the state.
Mhm.
So we see that as a viable solution.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I think I'll turn to a question really around perhaps lessons learned, and this has to do with the Lahaina wildfires. And so from where you sit, either from speaking from your previous role at Haima or your new role in the governor's office, um, what would you say are some of the major lessons learned that stand out about the response and long-term recovery in Maui as a result of the wildfires?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So very high level speaking, strategically speaking, on the response side, I think for me, one of the biggest lessons learned was that response within the state often relied in some form or fashion, both at state and the county levels, to what I would call a reserve or collateral duty type work process. So meaning that somebody from another agency other than say Haima might have a dual role in response, or might do some other type of like ESF, emergency support function work for Haima, but their real job might be in Department of Health, right? So this dual hatting of positions, what it does is it makes it so that it's very difficult outside of the emergency to move plans and procedures forward, so that when you need those in an emergency, they're ready, tested, and available. People understand and know how to use these. So you have a slow building of those, and then once you're in the emergency, these people who are assuming the response and recovery roles, you put them in a full-time job. It's a full-time job and then some, but yet there's some, in some cases, in many cases, they're still required to carry on their regular paying job or their salary job, the position they were hired for the state to do. And that means that on top of not having completed plans, you're working somebody basically to death in this. They can't keep the pace up. And then there's usually no one else to replace them. And so you start seeing the work go down, and because they just can't maintain that pace. And then when they do break away or can't go any further, then there's not a good bench. There's not a deep bench to come in and replace these people. So when during the fires, for instance, multiple states through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact sent workers here to help augment our work teams because of some of those problems. So that would be on the response side. I think the recovery side is another piece that up until COVID, the state really didn't address recovery in, I guess you could say, a structured way. COVID started that, and then kind of had a little break in COVID when things kind of came out of COVID and started working good. But then the fires came just a couple years after COVID, right? And then the immediate need, because of the damage of the fires, the state put together and expanded the recovery office to where my role is today. And so we have 6 people. We're working for a permanent position, so that's good. And similarly, Maui County put together a permanent recovery office position. So, you know, they quickly saw, once they started moving into recovery, that you need to invest in these things. And then lastly, I would say in our normal structure, we're really good at bringing people together. There's no doubt about that. We have a really big communal focus and eye on community. But when you're in exigent circumstances, there has to be a transition to direct leadership and being able to meet timelines urgently and have a sense of urgency in your work. And that's something we need to practice. We need to practice not only in what I would say exigent leadership, but also understand that from our emergency workforce, that when you enter in that environment, it's, you know, we're not going to take a vote. It's not communal. We have to have direction. You have to start moving very quickly, or our victims and survivors suffer, and they suffer for a long time.
So maybe to that point, David, is you and I met over a conversation back in 2019 at the Hawaii Agriculture Conference, where you joined myself and Chad Buck and a number of the other emergency management agency leads. And there was a discussion there, and I think it's been ongoing, about bridging public and private sector planning. So maybe would you be willing to provide us with a brief update on what progress has been made since then, and perhaps what gaps remain?
Yeah, so I think this is definitely one of the weaknesses of the state. We started tackling it, like you said, back in that time frame. I'm not sure, and to my knowledge, I don't believe that we've actually secured any contingency contracts around that. But again, with the fire, definitely again has highlighted that this needs to be revisited, and to try to work to secure those contingency contracts so that you can quickly enable capabilities that rest with outside the state. In our office, we're looking at 2 and 3 possibilities of that, and also some that might not just be a contingency contract, but a straight up state or public-private partnership. So, for instance, if we could do something with the food and warehousing, maybe we could move to a vendor-managed inventory setup where we could make an agreement with the big box companies to run these vendor-managed warehousing or surplus that would be more heavily in response-oriented products, and then they could move the stock and everything. And maybe if the state, for instance, their part would be to build the warehouse and sponsor the warehouse, and let the vendor manage the inventory and so forth. So I think there's several models out there that are successful in the emergency management area, and definitely, I know our office recognizes that as a weakness, and we are trying to figure out ways where we can leverage our private partners to do the things that they do the best. You know, communications is another one of those areas where the private industry is probably much better than the government. in its operation.
Well, having said that, and that there is this kind of formal kind of command and control or top-down in emergency management response, what are your thoughts about, and this kind of signals toward our upcoming food system summit, in your view, how can Hawaii's formal disaster preparedness system that you've just been describing be strengthened through closer collaboration with community-based organizations or the University of Hawaii, for example?
Yeah, so I think on the community side is being in close touch with the county emergency management agencies. They are the ones who should be in close contact, in your community group. They should be able to foster those relationships at the local level. They should be your first kind of response network, because ideally in the state system, the county responds first, and when they become overwhelmed, then they reach to the state to help support what they need. That's not to say that community groups can't help the state either. So the state does have an emergency support function. Groups that NGOs, community organizations, and other private industry should be able to become a part of in their area of expertise. And so that through that type of network, you would get a better communication of what needs to happen, or what type of support needs to happen, where it needs to happen, and then who's organizing it. And then that would make for a better strategic response. But it really does start at the counties to get in touch with your local emergency management agency and figure out what they're doing with your community, and then how your community can help them respond to you.
Very good. Well, we're quickly running out of time. What I think I'm going to do is just kind of pivot toward a brief overview of our upcoming Hawaii Food System Summit. So David, thank you. And I think if there are follow-up questions for David, please write to Ioane and and we can pass them on to David and we can get some responses. I'm just going to quickly do screen share and let everybody know a little bit of details about the upcoming Food System Summit. And then we'll bring this conversation to a close. Can everybody see my screen? You good? Yep. All right. So in order to play this role of coming alongside this this formal disaster response system, this year's annual Food System Summit is organized around the theme of food system resilience and disaster preparedness. So the summit is an initiative of the Transforming Hawaii's Food System Together initiative. We run the summit each year, and it's really intended to bring people together to have these important conversations about how we can build a more robust, resilient, and equitable food system. And so this year's summit is happening December 8th and 9th at the Value-Added Food Processing Facility in Wahiawa. David's going to be there to provide some high-level summaries. But the intention of the summit this year is really discussing how can we come together to build functional redundancy in the system. How can we better understand what are the critical points of vulnerability in the food system of Hawaii, some of which David reviewed in detail. And in the case of some kind of natural disaster, or in a socially constructed disaster like the one that we're living through with the cuts to SNAP benefits, how can we come together to respond adequately to ensure household food security does not increase significantly? So this last year, the Food System Summit was organized around household food insecurity. This year around food system resilience and disaster preparedness. But we intend to continue these dialogues in collaboration with our community partners and state partners like David, in order to figure out what are the best ways that we can build synergies across the public and private sector in the NGO world and the University of Hawaii. So just very briefly, just to give everybody a sense of what we're going to attempt to do through this year's summit. These are the core objectives. The event was constructed based on a set of core outcomes and objectives. And so the first one is really understanding elements of Hawaii's food system, like David described, and what's happening in terms of formal planning. Some of you know that we were successful in collaboratively passing Act 239. It's a interagency food system working group and planning process. So we want to speak to what's happening in terms of state level food system planning and what is the role of disaster preparedness and food system resilience in the context of this planning process. One key element of the Food System Summit this year is going to be on learning from frontline experiences. So we're going to have several speakers and panel discussions about what happened in different events, including the Lahaina wildfires, helping us understand from a private sector perspective, as well as those who are on the ground from the NGO and community perspective of what happened and what worked and what did not, and what are some of the implications of the lessons learned from Lahaina and other natural disasters. Again, we want to make sure everybody understands what are some of these key points of vulnerability in the food and agricultural sector, and help each other understand who is doing what, so we can come alongside one another to build greater resilience in the system. Last thing I'll share before we bring this to a close is we really want to engage in cross-sector collaboration. As discussed, there's a role of the state and the county and the FEMA, but some of those roles and responsibilities are shifting as we speak. We know that FEMA is becoming less and less able perhaps to respond to significant natural disasters, with some of the funding being reduced. So we want to make sure that we understand what is the context that we are operating in, and how do we need to build new alliances to ensure proper response in the case of natural disasters. So we want to form also, a sense of responsibility and connection among one another. We often operate in silos, and that's why I've really enjoyed my relationship with David, is we've been able to bring key actors together and build new relationships that allow us to have a stronger response to some of these ongoing and acute crises. We want to really build solutions. So one of the ideas of the annual Food System Summit is to articulate what are the policy ideas. So David is probably a holder of a couple of policy recommendations that we should all be familiar with. Others in the community are also going to have policy ideas that we should discuss, be aware of, and weigh in on as they move through the 2026 legislative session. And then we want to track progress and share emerging opportunities, really trying to build knowledge of what are the practical steps that people can take leaving the Food System Summit, so that we can work together in concert and build greater response capacity to any future natural disaster. So I invite you to join and actively participate in the annual Food System Summit this year. We are at over capacity in terms of registration. We are going to be recording this year's event, so we will post the recordings of the summit after the event and provide a detailed overview in terms of descriptions and videos and interviews coming out of the summit after December 9th. So I think we'll pause here. We have just a couple of minutes left. I think I'll turn it over to Ioane to wrap us up, and we will bring this conversation to a close. So thank you all for participating. Thank you, David, for your views on disaster preparedness and resilience in Hawaii. And we'll look forward to the summit on December 8th and 9th.
Thank you.
Mahalo nui to you both. David, that was a wealth of knowledge, extremely informative presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Albie, thank you for sharing everything with the Food System Summit. Anybody has any questions or anything, please email us at klmao@hawaii.edu, and we'll be processing this as soon as possible and getting this copy out through our MailChimp newsletter. Please share with folks outside of that network and encourage them to sign up so we can get more of this out to everybody. Again, just thank you all so much for attending, and we hope to see you at our next event. Aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha. Thank you.